One of the unique outcomes of living in pandemic times is that we're all forced to be a little bit closer together than we ever have been before. And this unquestionably affects our marriages. I'm sitting with Lori Snyder, a licensed clinical social worker and a registered nurse. Today, we're focusing on marriage in pandemic times. Early in the pandemic, Lori, there were some guesses that this forced close proximity that we have would be detrimental for marriages, that it would actually create a situation where more marriages came to an end. But research has shown that the exact opposite has happened. In fact, there have been fewer divorces and more marriages holding together. So let's jump right into the issue at hand. What can you tell us about the challenges of marriage when all of these normal routines of life have changed?
Yeah, for sure the pandemic has affected so many aspects of our lives in so many ways. Marriage being front and center, from the stresses of changes in routines, working remotely, some people losing their jobs, changes in childcare and social connections and how we get together socially. And those really do add, on the front end, a lot of stressors, things that we struggle to cope with. It can feel very overwhelming. And in any of the parts of our lives where we maybe personally are struggling to cope, those areas are also going to be affected. Marriages can really take a hit sometimes. Relationships can take a hit. If we're not our best selves, those stresses can trickle down. But it's interesting because it has not been all negative. And I've seen that in my practice. I've witnessed it in a lot of areas. And I guess first of all, we have an opportunity to come together. We have a chance to sort of lean on each other like we wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that the pandemic has sort of shined a spotlight on how important our support systems really are. Our marriages, our families, churches, and communities. And however, when they aren't well developed or maintained, they can also crack under pressure. The pandemic, along with other factors of daily life, even some of the election challenges, social unrest, they can be exhausting and they can make it harder for us to just maintain. But in every situation that we deal with, we have a lot of the same ways of coping that are really going to help, even in a big situation that feels out of control. So we've learned that slowing things down, getting a little creative, we actually have an opportunity to grow and do things differently and maybe adjust some things that needed tending to anyway.
Sure. So some of the ways that I've seen this happen is that we were all stuck at home. People started taking on home projects or started doing things like exercising that they hadn't been doing before. Is that the kind of example that you're talking about, and how does it apply to like a relationship situation?
Right, exactly. So those challenges might be just in how do we do what we normally do to do well. We've lost our buffers that would normally keep us in a good place. But when people take a look around and they figure out, okay, how can I have a date night? How can I get food on the table when I'm used to maybe going out much more often? People get creative and they rise to the occasion.
Can you say what you've seen in terms of challenges that might have arisen from the fact that people aren't just in close proximity but somehow have to find a way to do their job from home? Many people are working from home. That's a completely changed routine. All the kids are home. Perhaps you had to be playing not just parent but teacher too. That's changed a little bit now. At the time that we're doing this interview, more are studying in school in person, but still it's a challenge for a lot of families out there.
Exactly. So that's a really good example of where The routines have been lost, the way you normally do things, you can't do it the same way anymore, and people have had to really work together. Now, definitely there's been stress involved. People who have two parents working from home and trying to make sure their kids are doing online school or just taken care of, or a single parent trying to make sure that happens, that's going to be extra stress. But a lot of families have found that by talking about how they're going to handle it, by actually acknowledging this as a challenge that they need to face and work out together, the benefit has been that they've valued each other more. They've seen the effort that the other has made. But there are a couple of sides to this, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges too.
Sure. So a little bit of this has been high level so far, but let's zero in a bit. In our wedding vows, we make commitments to our spouses, and they're meant to last a lifetime. But in times like this, when then those routines are broken, when the stressors are higher, when we're having to make decisions that are fraught with all kinds of new anxieties, it's challenging to maintain our commitments in these circumstances. So talk to us a little bit about how our own moods, at the individual level, how our modes of coping impinge on our marriages.
Right, that's a great question. Who we are individually is what we bring to the table in our interactions. If I've had a bad day, if I've been stressed out, I'm going to have to work extra hard to not let that spill over onto you. And I might do that successfully all day long when I'm out and about at the grocery store, or going through my day if I'm interacting with coworkers, or even friends and family that I don't live with. But for a lot of us, when it comes to our home, we want to let down. That's the time when we come back to the place that we want to be able to relax. And maybe home wasn't even where we did relax. It might have been a different situation, and that has been lost. And so when those options, those normal ways of sort of coping aren't there, we do sometimes take it out on the people we live with.
Mm-hmm.
We're more irritable, we say things we don't mean. Definitely the pandemic has caused increased fear and anxiety around a wide variety of things, from financial to practical, how we're going to do the holidays, people who were in the middle of moves, all kinds of things that were moving in a certain direction that the pandemic then interrupted. And on a daily basis, that still happens. We just have to think that much more about how we're going to handle any interaction. Do we or don't we wear masks? Can we even attend something that we've been invited to? Mm-hmm. And all of that just takes a lot of mental energy, which we don't always do the best job of filling back up. For many of us, we take care of a lot of things out here, and we forget to take care of the things closest to us. Our own well-being, our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, and our relationship with our spouse. And on one hand, that's kind of nice. It means we're, responsible, giving people. Mm-hmm. But on a practical side, anything that doesn't get maintenance is going to suffer.
So it has a cost.
Mm-hmm.
Even Jesus models a kind of self-care.
That's right.
Right? He spends time away from the people, engaged in prayer and meditation with the Father, and even to the extent that people are looking for him and sometimes appear offended by that.
Right.
Let's go back for just a second to one of the things you said in this comment. You mentioned that before we even get home, maybe we're stopping at the grocery store, we're still investing that emotional energy to kind of put on a good face and have a kind, positive interaction with whoever it is we might be dealing with. But at home, we want to relax. Can you say a little more about how it's the home that we often treat as this safe space, and these closest relationships that we often take advantage of?
Exactly.
Unwittingly, but we just, I think, lean back on that trust that the people that we love the most are still going to love us even if I'm not at my best in this moment, but eventually that stacks up.
Exactly. Yeah, and thankfully, for many of us, we do have relationships where we're given the benefit of the doubt, sometimes more often than we deserve. But recognizing that those relationships need maintenance, that we ourselves and our emotional well-being, our physical well-being requires maintenance like anything else, whether you have a house or a car or a pet, anything that we have, we need to invest in order for it to do well, especially in the long run. And I think that's one of the things with the pandemic as it's worn on. Although we've gotten adjusted to some things, we've maybe ridden even further on the good that was, maybe the well-being that we'd been in the habit of doing, and it may be time for some people to step up and recognize some of the things that they really do need to do now to take care of themselves and to take care of their marriages. Mm-hmm. So I really work with people and think about this myself, that it starts closest to home, that your first stewardship, if you will, is with your own person, that you take care of your own well-being, and not in a selfish way, but like Jesus modeled. Sure. So we think about mind, body, spirit. The things that we think about, and are they helpful things? Are they things that are balanced? Are they overly focused on negative fears, negativity, fears, threats? Are we letting our minds be invigorated with things that are interesting, or ways that we can maybe be challenged to learn and grow? And the pandemic has plenty of opportunity for that, but we can also get really stuck. When we're activated, when we're more in an anxious state, it's much more likely that we're going to see the negative side of things. That's just neurobiology.
Sure.
As humans, we tilt a little bit towards the negative, but whichever we give more energy towards, that also builds. So we have to be careful that in our mind thoughts and our thoughts and the way our brains work, that we're not just inundated with negativity.
So one of the places that I think of immediately where we're inundated with this is if you have the 24-hour news cycle on, or you're constantly checking for the latest update of all of the terrible things that you think are happening out there in the world. Talk about the effects of that. Yes. Is that real? People have mentioned it. People wonder about the toxicity of some of these social media places. Is that affecting us?
Sure, and for everyone it's a little bit different. Some people don't spend as much time, some people are just more maybe negatively influenced by that because they may not have better balance in other parts of their life, but that can for sure be a trigger. Even just the habit of venting too much to friends or family members about how awful everything is can be something we really need to watch for. Mm-hmm. It keeps us frozen in that more negative state, and it's like a magnet. It just draws more of the same kinds of thoughts towards it. On the other hand, leaning in the other direction, kind of forcing ourselves or nudging ourselves or leaning towards the things that are more positive, that are okay, that haven't been affected. Sometimes it's the smallest thing can really balance that out. And while we're kind of on the three sides of us physically, this is a very big deal as well.
Yeah.
Those more negative thoughts can interfere with how we eat, the quality of our sleep, whether we choose to do other things that would maybe be good for us, like connecting with someone to have a conversation or getting out and exercising. But just doing some of those things can also really positively impact our mood and our thinking. So those really basic habits like, are we getting enough sleep? Is there something that I could do to be a little more proactive about that?
Sure.
Am I being a little careful about the kinds of food choices I make, and when I eat, and how much caffeine I'm taking in, how much alcohol I'm taking in, and doing some of those other kinds of things that balance us out, like hobbies or projects where we can really get engaged and feel like we're making a difference. And then the spirit side,
Yeah, say more about that.
which is in part our worldview, how we kind of interpret things. So when in pandemic times, when most of the focus is on the bad, how challenging this all is, as Christians, we have a really different perspective. We've got a God that we can trust, who leads us to have a little bit bigger picture of life.
Mm-hmm.
Our purpose isn't just about what the stock market did today.
Right.
We've got a hope that's secure, and it's not always easy to remember that on a daily basis.
Amen.
But we're invited to, we're challenged to, and we've got the option to be in the presence of a God who reminds us of that.
Tell me what you would advise for some spiritual habits that seem to work for people that you've worked with, right? To kind of feed that part of us in a way that affects that worldview, just the lens we look through in interpreting everything else.
I think one of the first things is to acknowledge that there is a lens. And so most of what we get from the world around us is not going to be through the lens of what God says. We live in a world that's broken, and it's affected by that every single day. It's not all bad, but it's definitely affected by that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, coming into the presence of God, there are all kinds of ways we do that. For sure in church, which that's been really affected for a lot of people.
Yes.
But anytime we hear His Word, anytime we remind ourselves of His Word through verses we know, songs we know, when we speak it to each other, words of encouragement, and in prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the ones that I like to talk to people about. I don't think God judges our prayer. I'm pretty sure that that's not the case. He wants us to come to Him in any state, and that's always, we're always welcome.
Yes.
But we can pray in a way that's just repeating our own thoughts over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Our worries and our anxieties and our frustrations and our angers. And while, again, God wants us to do that, He also wants us to hear His Word.
Mm-hmm.
He wants us to be reminded of what He says, that we don't have to be surprised by or panicked by the trouble all around us, that we should expect it, but also know that He's with us, that we're not alone, that He goes before us, that, and we've got all these great examples of people throughout the Bible that have been through very hard times.
Yes. For sure.
That we can draw some hope from, some encouragement from.
So we talked about our moods and how we cope, the normal ways that we go about that. Is there anything you wanted to add?
There is. So one of the things that we've learned in science, in neurobiology, is how much we impact each other.
Mm-hmm.
So in our marriages, if we want not our own well-being to just be okay, but we want better interactions with the people around us, with our spouses, we get frustrated sometimes because of maybe the mood that our spouse is in, or what they're going through, or some habit of theirs that's difficult for us. And when that's our focus, and it gets under our skin, and we let it get under our skin, and we're already kind of in a bad place, we're kind of giving away a lot of the things that we actually have control over that can make a real difference.
Mm-hmm.
So neurobiologically, when I'm in a calm, more positive, less reactive spot, I'm going to send a message to you that comes from not just my words, not just a look on my face, but just all of those things and more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to affect you. That's going to affect whoever I'm around. And in our marriages, a lot of times we blame each other. We get disappointed because our spouse doesn't respond the way we want. And it's understandable, it's natural. But if we want to make a difference, when we start with ourselves and get ourselves in a more anchored, better spot, we actually have the opportunity to be much more of a positive influence in how things flow back and forth in a marriage as well. Um, those unkind words, the cold shoulders that we give when we're not our best selves, they can really stick with the other person and make them doubt the quality of the relationship, and we don't always even realize that that's what's happening.
Sure.
So, so taking that time to take a step back, to tend to ourselves, and then be a little more proactive about the ways we interact, just like we would in so many other settings, at work or with a friend. We're a lot of times a little bit more careful about what we say and how we do things. And when we take a little extra effort in our marriages, it goes a long way. We have more power than we think.
Can you give an example? One of the things that comes to my mind is if I know that I'm not in one of my best moments, is it okay for me to say, this isn't about you, I just need a little bit of time, hold off and we can interact on this a little bit later, right? Because the other person, if we don't say anything, is just reading those nonverbal signals.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very good example. To give a heads up. Now, it might still be hard for the other person. They may have needed something from you that you saying, I can't do this right now, I need a little time, give me some time to get back to a better version of myself. It might still be hard for them to wait, but at least you're sort of giving them a heads up. You're cluing them in on where you are, and that can really be a helpful pattern to get in the habit of. And then maybe you give the same to your spouse when they've really had a tough day and they're not in the right frame of mind to maybe hear all about the challenges of your day.
Yeah. It's still challenging because I think in the midst of it all, to be able to verbalize that you need that time is its own one more extra thing to think of and remember to do, especially if it's not a habit, because in that moment I'm just in the midst of feeling all those feelings.
That's exactly right.
And carry them around. Right.
And so learning to pay attention to that inside yourself and just giving yourself a minute, take a breath, take a pause before you answer, ask for that minute. But that's one of using your body, if you can pay attention to when you feel tightness in your chest, tightness in your jaw, your thoughts are going way too fast. You've got that tone about them. Maybe you're a little bit tense in the stomach. Using those little tells as this is probably when I need to slow down. This is probably when I need to choose my words a little more carefully. I need to take a break myself before I spring into whatever task may be at hand. And that's one of the problems too in families. Sometimes we try to juggle so much.
Yeah.
It comes so fast, and we really just expect too much of ourselves. And the energy that it feels like it takes, though, I really like that one, because it's really different than we think, because the energy it takes to deal with an argument or hurt feelings is so much more than just taking the time to take a minute for yourself. Maybe say a little prayer.
Sure. Yeah.
Ask for some help. Remember the good thing about your spouse that you were looking forward to interacting with, even if that's not what you just met when you walked in the door.
Sure. Is there an approach to this, like say a couple could set up some kind of agreement with each other to say, we seem to have this challenge every now and again. Going forward, let's try to do this. And then when it comes up, it might not be such a surprise. It might not, from the other person who's receiving it, feel, hurtful. But it opens a space for practicing and maybe having the lesser cost on the front end than the bigger cost after the big blow up.
Yeah. Those conversations, a lot of times we think we've had them because we've expressed ourselves in an argument or under a time of stress, but that's really so different than having a calm conversation and making a plan. We do that with kids sometimes. We expect them to just know that this is what's going to happen in a day and what we expect of them, and it doesn't work. But if we take the time to say, okay, today we're going to get up at you need to be out of the house at 9. These are the 3 things we're going to do. Then I'm going to include, a break at the park, and then we're going to come home and do this, this, and this. It goes a lot more smoothly.
Sure.
We're thinking about what it's going to be like for them, and they're a little bit more prepared. It works the same in a conversation like that. Hey, when I come home from work, if it's been a long day, it's probably not going to work for me to answer 6 questions about the evening.
Mm-hmm.
Could I have like 10 or 15 minutes to change clothes, just regroup a little bit? I know some people who do that on their trip home.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just sort of finishing out their work day, they actually use that time as their transition time to think about how they want to be when they walk in the door.
Mm-hmm.
But I've learned, that's one of my favorite things about my job, I've learned so many creative ways that people approach things like that. Taking turns with when they have exercise time, so that they both are taken care of.
Yeah.
You want your spouse to be well.
Yeah.
You're going to enjoy them more if they're well,
Mm-hmm.
but we forget sometimes that there is an investment in that to make
Sure.
that happen.
One of the things you make me think about in terms of the prep on the ride home is I hate the ride home because of traffic.
Yeah.
Now, having moved here versus the place that I previously lived, it isn't as bad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little less stressful. But one of the things that I was really struck by, I read it somewhere, is that when I get home, I have 2 little girls who are coming to the door to say, "Hi, Daddy," and they're so excited. And I was convicted at one point that I don't want them to experience the heavy emotional, mental taxation of my day to be delivered to them, and that be the first thing they experience. And this idea that I read from wherever that said, if I can habitually greet them every day like I'm as excited to see them as they are me, far better of a gift is that than to plan to take them to Disney World. They're going to remember and be impacted in the long term by just that. So I at least am trying to prepare to respond and receive their greeting that way when I get home, even though they know I'm going to need a couple of minutes to unwind a little bit, put some things away, change clothes as you mentioned, and get ready for the next part of the day. But traffic challenges my ability to do that. I think since I've learned that lesson, it has been helpful. But it was I think a good little trick and important to me because my kids are important to me.
Yeah, and I'll just say that it's as good as that is for them, and that's huge. It's really good for you too. You've just pressed the pause button on all that stress, and you've allowed yourself to experience these great little girls that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing in marriages. We're all married to spouses who have blessings and challenges,
Yep.
weaknesses, and so do we. But when we look forward to interacting with them and the things that we step in with a more appreciative, positive anticipation, without too much pressure,
Sure.
without too much expectation,
Yeah.
it's good for us. Now we're shifting out of this more stressful way of being, and maybe you can drive in traffic even with a different perspective. It just depending on where you put your attention. But that's a great example.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah.
Talk to me about some of the challenges that are actually affecting marriages in the midst of this pandemic. We've done a little high level. We've zeroed in on thinking of yourself and your approach. But what are some of the outside things that are happening? What are some of the preconditions within a relationship where maybe troubles and challenges are exacerbated now by this stress?
Yeah, and I think a lot of stress is cumulative. So if you were already dealing with a number of things and the pandemic has actually added to that, it can be really tough. If finances were already tight and then whatever you do for work has been really interrupted by the pandemic, it's just the layering of stress. If a family already was struggling with communication, maybe hadn't really needed or taken the time or found ways to talk through problems and face challenges, and they kind of just went their own ways. They kind of operated, couples do this sometimes, they sort of live in the same house and their tasks are really divided, and it can be, that's not a bad model, but it can keep you from learning how to work together. And then you're in a situation where you have to work together. if you don't really have those skills, it's either a crash course, or you can really feel a lot of stress and pressure. And I think the other thing that has been unique about this time has been around grief and loss.
Yeah.
So many people have gone through very tough things, or are going through tough things, illnesses, deaths, and that whole adjustment to that, the grief process, things that we normally do to help ourselves, from coming together for funerals to just even having the mental real estate to go there, has been interrupted. And so it kind of just, it can for some people sort of stay in this just below the surface spot, and it's like it's just one more thing that adds to the potential to sort of become dysregulated. And in marriages, if sometimes both people have gone through those kinds of experiences and they just don't have a lot left over to give each other.
True.
Now, I've definitely talked with some couples that have understood that that's where each other was, and they went other places, healthy places, to get through it, like maybe coming to a counselor to just process things. But I've also encountered some couples where it was those sets that really just had them bickering more, being even more disappointed, really just overwhelmed with all the things that they were having to deal with. And then that's when sometimes people do talk about divorce and separation, and maybe they'd already had that thought come through their head a few times, but then in these circumstances it becomes even more of like the thing that they can do. A lot of times when we've got so many things going on, we just need something. We need to do something. And to be honest, that's when suicide can be a threat for a lot of people. When they feel like there's nothing that they can do. They feel so hopeless and so powerless that that's like the one thing that feels like that's what they can do. And I think in some ways, like divorce and separation, or just closing off from your partner, it feels like the only thing you can do. What I know is that there are always things you can do. There are so many things. And our moods change. You know, where we are one day, 1 minute, and then where we are a few days down the road, it really can, sometimes even hours, it can change so much. So getting a feel for that, for people who have gone through some hard times before, and then we're in the pandemic, they may be really frustrated, like, oh my gosh, here we go again. But going through hard times also teaches us that we can get through them. And so it's, you know, is this stress so much that people feel like they just can't cope? I think that's when so many of our lives, including our relationships, are the most affected. Or is it a situation where we can step back and say, okay, I know that things get really hard sometimes, and I've committed to continuing to try. For myself, if it's something like suicide, I've committed to keep trying, and I know that my mood does change. For people who are new to feeling those feelings, I think it can be really risky. For people who've had those feelings before, it can be really heavy. But same for things like divorce and, you know, is this relationship savable? Is it worth it? Is this person gonna ever change? To have a little bit of a sense of, well, especially from God's perspective, we always have hope. We're always on a journey of change, just like many of our kindergarten teachers taught us that we are works in progress.
Let's talk for just a minute about the often awkward thought and effort of finding a counselor. If that's something that someone's thinking about, they need to do, still, while I think the stigma has gotten better, it's stigmatized, and I think that's probably built in a little bit to the sense of we start self-evaluating that I'm not good enough to be able to handle this on my own.
Right.
Talk about the value of being able to talk to someone who doesn't have the emotional investment in that relationship and in what's being experienced, can have an objective look, but it's also well trained to walk someone through this, and why it's okay and how to get that started.
Yeah. It is, I agree that one of the benefits that a lot of people have experienced around the pandemic is a lot more people are talking about how hard it is, about emotions, about anxiety. While that can kind of ramp things up, it also has the effect for a lot of people of not feeling so alone in their thoughts and feelings, like they're not the only one. And I think that's one of the benefits of counseling. You get to work in a setting where that's exactly what you're supposed to do, to come talk about things that you're kind of afraid to even acknowledge to yourself, or that you haven't known how to face or look at or work through. You've tried all of the resources you have, and it's just what you know, and that's so you feel kind of stuck. So finding a counselor, I will say, is a little bit challenging right now, but not impossible. It just might mean a little bit longer wait, like a lot of things we've had to kind of accept with that. But a good way to find a counselor is through friends, which means you have to kind of talk about the fact that you're looking for one, and hopefully that would feel a little more comfortable now. Talking to your pastor or someone else, sometimes through schools, they have good resources. Your family doctor is a great first start. First of all, to make sure that there isn't something physically going on that might be contributing that the doctor would want to address, but also because it's a good resource for finding a counselor. And actually, insurance companies can be a pretty good way of finding a counselor. They can give you, if you have an insurance plan, most of them cover counseling of some sort. You can ask them for a counselor who's faith-friendly. You can ask for someone who specializes in marriages or relationships, or something from your background that might be part of what's going on in the moment. If you've had hard stuff in the past, going through something difficult in the present can sometimes bring up old feelings too. It can sometimes help you know that you can get through things, but it also can kind of be another one of those layering moments. So looking for someone that maybe you can ask for someone that maybe specializes in one of those backgrounds, whether it's addictions or abuse.
Sure.
And then go forward from there. I think that one of the misconceptions that we touched a little bit on earlier is that our emotions are sort of separate from our physical selves. And I think that there's much more of an understanding of how our brains and our bodies and our spirit, they're all one, constantly interacting. And so just like some people wouldn't want to go to the doctor when they've got, a persistent headache, or, really low energy, or, a family history of diabetes and they're heading down that path, they wouldn't necessarily want to go. Some people would, but they would know that it's the right thing to do. And when we're struggling, when we're dealing with things that do affect our emotions, there too, it's wise to talk to somebody, to try and get some skills and some understanding of where the problem areas are that would help you get back on track. Sometimes you could look at it almost like going to a physical therapist, or even a coach or a personal trainer if you really wanted to accomplish some improvement in an area where you're not as strong or not as skilled. And so I think those are all some helpful ways of thinking about counseling that help get people over the hump.
Let's back up and talk just one more issue that's often perceived as a negative. You talked a little while ago about grief and how we're all struggling with that. And oftentimes we think of grief in terms of losing someone, to a funeral. They've died of old age or sickness, or tragically perhaps due to the pandemic. But there are a lot of other reasons that I think we're experiencing grief right now. Part of it is a loss of routine. Part of it is a loss of the community where it gave me a certain inarticulable something, but that contributed to the positive well-being and the health of my life, to my spirit. It might have been the fact that I can't go to church in person. It might have been the fact that, I was a frequenter at Starbucks, and it was my third place, and it was my office sometimes where I'd work, but I got to know people there. Or there was a pub that I like to go to, or we always had date night at this restaurant. And almost all of that has been, in some way, shape, or form, significantly less accessible. And other things. Talk about how grief of that sort is affecting us.
I feel like that's a very helpful way to think about some of the things we're going through. It gives us an opportunity to sort of acknowledge the hardness, the things that we're missing, the things that have changed. And it also helps us understand some of the things that we think and feel as a result of it. We're going to have denial sometimes, where we just don't want to accept that we really have to deal with this for a holiday season coming up, or a wedding coming up. And sometimes we don't make the best choices under those circumstances. That we're going to have sadness. We're going to feel sad because of things that we're missing. That anger, that we have to do the things we have to do, or that things have been interrupted. To know that those are some things we're going to feel is very important, as well as acceptance. When we say, well, this is how it is, at least for now. This is something I'm going to have to find a way through. And that's kind of that other part of the grief and loss cycle, where we actually get to the moving on portion, where we can kind of look at the circumstances that we have and say, okay, this is how it is. How am I going to cope with this? How can I find my new Starbucks? And all the things that included. Some good coffee, okay. A place where I'm stepping away that's sort of just comfortable for me, okay. And some connection with other people that maybe I don't know all that well. And I'd like to just have those kinds of interactions. Okay, I might be able to find some ways to address each of those needs.
Yeah. Some things seem to be loosening up and making it a little bit easier to cope these days. But as we film this, we're going into the holiday season, as you've mentioned. Cases are surging. Great news this morning about the possibility of a vaccine, but still, yes, timing-wise, probably a long way off for most of the rest of us. So let's wrap up this portion and talk about some of the hopeful things that we can expect, and can you give us some advice for marriages as we go into the holiday season? While there may be hope that this pandemic comes to an end sometime down through the future, these next couple of months is not going to experience that, and in fact, we might be experiencing a few worse things in our society, some greater challenges. I know for my wife and I, we're not sure what we're going to do for the holidays yet, because it seems so contingent on what's going on in the wider society.
Yeah, I'm going to start there with the holidays, picking up with that a little bit. And it's if this gets listened to post-holidays for anyone, whatever your normal routine might be, that's still being interrupted, you can kind of substitute these thoughts for that. But just like after a death, it can be really helpful to not feel like you have to do exactly the same thing around those big events, because it's going to feel so different. When you've lost someone and Christmas comes around, some people want all those traditions and they feel connected. That's fine. Others, it just doesn't feel right to have that person missing. And I think thinking about the holidays and even some of the other events that come up when in pandemic times is to take a little bit of the same approach. Does it feel comforting to try and keep a lot of those traditions, whatever ones you really can keep? Do that. Maybe if you decide you can't go to church, but you've always gone to church on the holidays, find a way to be involved in a service. It will feel good. It will encourage you and remind you of what hasn't changed. But I think I've heard a lot of people talking about, and I think it's some really helpful perspectives to sort of loosen the expectations a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That, to find different ways to do gift exchanges, because who knows how shipping is going to be.
Right.
To think about other creative ways that you can be together or connect. I have a client who is not going to be able to see her nieces and nephews this holiday, and she's decided to write letters, personal letters to them, and they're all in their teens and early 20s, and she thought that would have been really meaningful to her to get that from an aunt at that stage of their life, and so that's one of the things she's going to give in lieu of kind of what are sometimes broken conversations with a whole group of people. I think for people who are maybe more isolated and are really feeling the need for connection, even if they have a spouse, it can be a little bit more challenging. And to really acknowledge those feelings and look for some ways that they can connect in any kind of creative way. Definitely with each other.
Yeah.
And maybe with some people in the community or neighbors in ways that are safe. I think that's, so many of us are going to be having different years this year, that we can maybe turn towards each other a little bit.
For sure. I've been talking with Snyder, who's a licensed clinical social worker and a registered nurse, about marriage in pandemic times. We spent a lot of great time in this session talking about some of the challenges, some of the ways that we can focus on ourselves and get a sense of our own feelings and use that as leverage for how we relate to others and how we cope through these pandemic times. Thanks for being with us.